Welcome to Curio Hour. What follows is a long one: heists, mysteries, and moments history nearly forgot, gathered into one continuous listen. Get comfortable and let these stories carry you towards sleep. Over 2,000 years ago, someone built a machine of astonishing complexity. A device of dozens of precision gears, capable of predicting the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Nothing else like it would appear for more than 1,000 years. By all rights, it should not exist. And yet, it was pulled from the bottom of the sea. It has been called the world's first computer, built in an age of sailing ships and oil lamps. This is the story of the Antikythera Mechanism. Our story begins in the year 1900, with a group of Greek sponge divers sailing home across the Mediterranean Sea. A storm forced them to take shelter near a small, rocky island called Antikythera, lying between the larger islands of Crete and the Greek mainland. While they waited for the weather to clear, the divers decided to do some diving in the area, hoping to find sponges in the waters off the island. One diver descended into the deep, and what he saw on the seabed terrified him. He surfaced in a panic, babbling about a pile of dead bodies on the ocean floor. But they were not bodies. When the others investigated, they realized the diver had stumbled upon the wreck of an ancient ship, scattered with bronze and marble statues. The arms and faces of the statues, half buried in the sand, had looked like human remains in the gloom. The divers had found a treasure trove from the ancient world. The wreck was that of a large cargo ship, which had sunk around 2,000 years ago, carrying a fortune in art and goods, likely bound for Rome. The Greek government organized one of the first major underwater archaeological recoveries in history. Over months, divers brought up statues, coins, jewelry, and pottery. The recovered treasures were taken to a museum in Athens, where scholars set to work cataloging them. And among the haul was something that, at first, no one paid much attention to. It was an unremarkable-looking lump. A corroded mass of bronze and rotted wood, encrusted by 2,000 years under the sea. It seemed like little more than debris. For months, it sat ignored among the more glamorous statues and treasures. Then the lump began to dry out and crack apart. And as it split, something extraordinary was revealed. Inside the corroded mass, peeking out from the bronze, was the unmistakable shape of a gear wheel. A precise, toothed cog of a kind that should not have existed in the ancient world. A scholar examining it could hardly believe his eyes. Finely cut gears were the stuff of clockwork, of machinery, of an age of precision engineering that lay many centuries in the future. Yet here was such a gear, embedded in an object that had sunk 2,000 years ago. It was as if someone had found a modern wristwatch in an ancient tomb. This was the first hint of what the world would come to call the Antikythera Mechanism. An understanding it would take a century of painstaking work. The trouble was that the mechanism was in pieces. It had broken into several fragments, corroded and fragile, with much of it lost or fused together by time. For decades, scholars studied the fragments, but the technology of the time was not advanced enough to see inside them, where the most important details were hidden. They could see gears on the surface and faint inscriptions in ancient Greek. But the inner workings, the heart of the machine, remained locked inside the corroded bronze. The breakthroughs came as technology improved. In the modern era, researchers turned powerful tools on the fragments. X-rays and then advanced three-dimensional scanning. Using high-resolution imaging, scientists could finally peer inside the fragments without damaging them and map the gears hidden within, layer by layer. What they found was staggering. The mechanism contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, and possibly many more, all working together in a single, intricate system. The gears were cut with remarkable precision, their teeth carefully shaped, their sizes calculated to produce exact ratios. This was the work of a true master craftsman. The whole device had been housed in a wooden case, about the size of a large book, with dials on the front and back, and a small hand crank on the side. By turning that crank, the user set all the gears in motion at once, and the dials would display their results. But what exactly did it calculate? The answer was the cosmos itself. The Antikythera Mechanism was an astronomical calculator, a model of the heavens as the ancient Greeks understood them. Turning the crank moved the device forward or backward in time. And as it did, the dials showed the positions of the sun and the moon against the background of the stars. It could display the phases of the moon, showing whether it would be full or new on any given date, using a clever little rotating ball, half black and half silver. It tracked the cycles of the calendar, marking the months and the years. It is believed to have shown the positions of the known planets as they wandered across the sky. Most impressively of all, it could predict eclipses. The dials indicated when eclipses of the sun and moon were likely to occur, sometimes years in advance. And it even tracked the cycle of the ancient Greek games, including the Olympics, marking which festival would be held in which year. It was a calendar of civilization itself. All of this from a hand-cranked box of bronze gears made 2,000 years ago. It compressed the rhythms of the heavens into a device you could hold in your lap. To appreciate just how astonishing this is, consider that geared mechanisms of comparable complexity would not appear again in Europe until the great astronomical clocks of the medieval period. More than 1,000 years separate the Antikythera Mechanism from anything else like it. So who built this impossible object? The truth is, we do not know for certain. No name is attached to it, but scholars have been able to make some educated guesses about its origins. The inscriptions and the style of the work suggest it was made somewhere in the Greek world, around the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era. Some have linked it to the great thinkers of the age, including the famous mathematician and inventor Archimedes, who was said to have built devices modeling the heavens. Others point to the island of Rhodes, a renowned center of astronomy at the time, as a possible birthplace for the device. But these remain theories, not certainties. What is clear is that the mechanism could not have been the only one of its kind. A device this sophisticated must have been the product of a long tradition of skill and knowledge. There must have been earlier, simpler versions, and the expertise to refine them over generations. The Antikythera Mechanism was a pinnacle, not a lucky accident. And this raises a haunting question. If the ancient world possessed knowledge and skill like this, what happened to it? Why did such technology vanish for over 1,000 years? The likely answer is loss. As empires rose and fell, as libraries burned and knowledge was scattered, much of the ancient world's learning simply disappeared. The skills to build such a device may have been held by only a handful of masters, their knowledge passed down by hand, never widely recorded. When they died, it could die with them. The Antikythera Mechanism, then, is more than a marvel. It is a reminder of how fragile knowledge can be, and how much brilliance the past may have held that we have simply lost. Today, the fragments of the mechanism are kept in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, displayed alongside detailed reconstructions of how it once worked. Researchers continue to study it, building working models, decoding its inscriptions, and uncovering new details about this extraordinary ancient machine. It stands as the oldest known device of its kind. A genuine analog computer, conceived and built by human hands more than 2,000 years ago. It tells us that our ancestors were not the simple, primitive people we sometimes imagine. They gazed at the heavens, understood their rhythms, and captured them in turning bronze. A masterpiece of genius, lost beneath the waves for 2,000 years and recovered to remind us of just how clever the ancient world truly was. The Antikythera Mechanism. In the autumn of 1922, the streets of New York City descended into chaos. Gangs roamed the sidewalks, fights broke out, and people were injured and arrested. The cause of all this violence was not money or politics or crime. It was a hat, specifically the Straw Hat. For several days, the great city went to war over what men should wear on their heads. This is the bizarre true story of the Straw Hat Riot. To understand how a city could riot over headwear, we have to step back into the world of the early 20th century, when hats were not optional. In that era, a respectable man simply did not go outside without a hat. To be bareheaded in public was considered improper, even shocking. Hats were a vital part of a man's outfit, a marker of his status, his respectability, and his place in society. Every man wore one. And there were rules. Strict, unwritten rules about which hats were appropriate and when. Fashion in those days was governed by a rigid social code. One of the most popular hats of the summer season was the straw boater. A stiff, flat-topped, flat-brimmed hat made of straw, light and cool for the warm months. The straw boater was the hat of summer. Men across the city wore them through the hot months, a cheerful sight on the crowded sidewalks. But the straw hat was strictly a summer item. As the weather cooled in the autumn, fashion demanded that men switch to a felt hat instead. And this is where the trouble began. Because there was an unofficial deadline, a date after which wearing a straw hat was considered a serious fashion crime. By tradition, this cutoff fell in mid-September. After that date, no self-respecting man was supposed to be seen wearing a straw hat. The summer was over. The exact date varied, but it was widely understood to be around the 15th of September. Wear your straw hat after that, and you were breaking the rules. Now there was a strange and aggressive custom attached to this rule. If a man was caught wearing a straw hat past the deadline, others felt entitled to knock it off his head. And not just knock it off. The custom was to grab the offending straw hat, throw it to the ground, and stomp on it, destroying it entirely. This was usually meant in fun, a kind of rough seasonal prank, especially among young men and boys. A bit of mischief to mark the change of season. For years, this had been a relatively harmless, if rowdy, tradition. A few crushed hats, a few laughs, and life went on. But in 1922, things got out of hand. What had always been a bit of seasonal fun would, that autumn, tip over into something genuinely dangerous, sweeping across the city in a way no one expected. The setting was New York City in September of 1922, a brash, crowded, energetic city in the middle of the roaring 20s. The spark, as is often the case, came from young people pushing the boundaries. A group of youths decided to start the hat smashing a little early, before the official deadline. On the east side of Manhattan, near the docks, gangs of young men began snatching and stomping straw hats, even though the proper date had not yet arrived. Their early targets included a group of dock workers. And these were not men who took kindly to having their hats destroyed. The dock workers fought back. What might have been a bit of harmless mischief instead turned into a genuine brawl, spilling out into the streets. The fight grew large enough to stop traffic on a nearby bridge, and the police had to be called in to break it up. But the trouble was only just beginning. Word of the clashes spread, and over the following days, the hat smashing exploded across the city, far beyond a few rowdy youths. Gangs of young men, sometimes hundreds strong, roamed the streets of New York, hunting for anyone wearing a straw hat. They armed themselves, in some cases, with sticks that had nails driven through them, the better to spear and rip the hats from people's heads. What had been a light-hearted tradition had curdled into something genuinely menacing. The city was gripped by days of escalating violence. Men who refused to give up their hats or who fought back were beaten. The roving gangs did not always stop at simply destroying the offending headwear. People were knocked down. Fights broke out on street corners and in subway stations. The chaos spread across multiple neighborhoods of the city. The violence was indiscriminate. Some of those targeted were not even breaking the supposed rule, but were attacked simply for wearing a straw hat at all. The police were overwhelmed. Officers struggled to control the roaming gangs, making numerous arrests as the disorder rippled through the streets. Some men, it was reported, were sent to the hospital with injuries received while defending their hats or while being caught up in the brawls. It was a genuinely dangerous situation. For several days, a simple item of summer fashion had turned parts of New York into a battleground. The newspapers covered the chaos with a mix of alarm and amusement. The Straw Hat Riot, as it came to be known, was front-page news. The sheer absurdity of it all was not lost on people, even at the time. A city descending into violence over the seasonal etiquette of hats. And yet, beneath the comedy, there was real harm being done. The authorities and city leaders called for calm and for the violence to stop. Magistrates who dealt with the arrested rioters took a dim view of the chaos, handing out fines and warnings and scolding those involved for their foolishness. One judge reportedly remarked on the ridiculousness of grown men rioting over hats and the danger such mob behavior posed to ordinary citizens. Gradually, after several days, the violence began to die down. The initial frenzy burned itself out, and the police regained control of the streets. The Straw Hat Riot of 1922 came to an end, leaving behind injuries, arrests, a great many ruined hats, and a thoroughly bewildered city. It was not even the only time this happened. There had been straw hat scuffles in earlier years, and there would be more incidents in the years that followed. But the 1922 riot was by far the most severe and famous, the moment when the strange tradition spiraled most dramatically out of control. In the aftermath, the whole affair stood as a strange lesson in how a small social custom, taken too far by a crowd, can erupt into real chaos. It is a vivid example of mob mentality, of how quickly a bit of seasonal mischief can escalate when enough people get swept up in it. What began as a harmless prank among a few young men became, within days, a citywide outbreak of violence. No one planned it, no one led it, and yet a great metropolis was briefly consumed by it. But it also marked something larger. The Straw Hat Riot came near the end of the great age of the hat, as fashions were slowly beginning to change. In the decades that followed, the strict rules around hats gradually relaxed. The custom of switching hats by a fixed date and smashing those who did not faded away. Eventually, hats themselves became far less universal. The day would come when most men went bareheaded without a second thought, something unthinkable in 1922. And so the very idea of rioting over straw hats came to seem like a relic of a strange, vanished world with its rigid codes and seasonal rules. Today, the Straw Hat Riot is remembered as one of the most absurd episodes in the history of New York. A reminder of just how seriously people once took their fashion. It is hard to imagine, now, a city tearing itself apart over what men wore on their heads. And yet, for a few wild days in 1922, that is exactly what happened. A simple summer hat, an unwritten rule, and a city that briefly lost its mind. The strange and unforgettable story of the Straw Hat Riot. In the year 1816, something went terribly wrong with the seasons. Across much of the world, summer simply never came. Snow fell in June. Frost killed the crops in July and August. Lakes froze in the middle of summer, and a strange, dim gloom hung over the land. People had no idea why. The cause lay on the other side of the planet. This is the story of the year without a summer. To understand why an entire summer vanished, we have to travel to the other side of the world, to the islands of Indonesia, in the year 1815. There, on the island of Sumbawa, stood a towering volcano called Mount Tambora. It had been quiet for a very long time and was thought to be harmless. But deep beneath the mountain, enormous pressure had been building for centuries. And in April of 1815, Tambora unleashed it in the most violent way imaginable. The eruption of Mount Tambora was the most powerful volcanic eruption in all of recorded human history. Its scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The explosion blew the top off the mountain, reducing its height by thousands of feet. The blast was reportedly heard over 1,000 miles away. It ejected a staggering volume of rock, ash, and gas high into the atmosphere. The immediate devastation around the volcano was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of people died in the eruption and its immediate aftermath, from the blast, the falling ash, and the famine and disease that followed locally. But the true global impact of Tambora came not from the lava or the blast, but from what it threw high into the sky. The eruption blasted a vast quantity of gas and fine ash into the upper atmosphere, far higher than weather and rain could wash it away. In particular, it released enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide gas. High in the atmosphere, this gas formed a fine haze of tiny droplets that spread across the entire globe. This high-altitude veil of haze acted like a vast, thin curtain wrapped around the whole planet. And it had a dramatic effect on sunlight. The haze reflected a portion of the sun's light and warmth back into space before it could reach the surface of the Earth. The result was a phenomenon scientists now call a volcanic winter. With less of the sun's energy reaching the ground, temperatures around the world began to drop. It took many months for the full effect to take hold, as the haze spread and thickened across the northern hemisphere. By the following year, the consequences were severe. And so, in 1816, the year after the Great Eruption, the seasons broke down. People who had never heard of Tambora suddenly found their world turned cold and dark. In the spring of 1816, things seemed almost normal at first. But as the year went on, it became clear that something was deeply wrong with the weather. In the northeastern United States and Canada, the cold was shocking. In May, frost damaged crops. And then came June, which should have been warm and green. Instead, in June of 1816, snow fell across parts of New England and Canada. Snow in the heart of what should have been early summer. People were astonished and frightened. Snowdrifts piled up. Birds died in the cold. Newly shorn sheep perished in the unexpected freeze. And it did not end with June. Through July and August, hard frost struck again and again, killing crops just as they tried to grow. Lakes and rivers that should have been warm enough for swimming were instead found with ice on their surface in the middle of summer. The weather was wildly erratic. Warm spells would suddenly give way to killing frosts overnight, making it nearly impossible for farmers to grow anything. The sun itself looked strange. Because of the haze, sunsets around the world turned vivid and unusual, glowing with deep reds and oranges, an eerie beauty born of disaster. The cold was not confined to North America. Across the Atlantic, Europe was suffering too, in a year of relentless gloom, cold, and rain. Europe was still recovering from years of devastating war and was poorly prepared for a failed harvest. The cold and endless rain ruined crops across the continent. Constant rainfall flooded fields and rotted whatever managed to grow. The grain harvest failed across much of Europe, from Britain to the heart of the continent. And when harvests fail, hunger follows. The year without a summer brought widespread famine to many parts of the northern hemisphere. Food prices soared as grain became scarce. In many places, the cost of basic bread doubled, tripled, or rose even higher, far beyond what poor families could afford. People were reduced to eating whatever they could find. There are accounts of families surviving on wild plants and of livestock dying for lack of feed. It is considered one of the worst famines of the 19th century in the Western world. Tens of thousands, and likely many more, died from hunger and the diseases that came with it. The hardship triggered unrest. Food riots broke out in parts of Europe as desperate people protested the scarcity and the soaring prices. And it set people in motion. Many farmers in New England, ruined by the failed harvests, gave up and migrated westward, seeking better land and warmer weather. This wave of migration helped populate the American Midwest, reshaping the map of the young country, all set in motion by a volcano on the far side of the world. Throughout all of this suffering, almost no one understood the true cause. The link between a distant eruption and their freezing summer was completely unknown at the time. People searched for explanations. Some blamed sunspots which had been observed on the sun. Others saw the cold and darkness as a sign of divine anger or the end of days. It would be many decades before scientists fully understood how a great volcanic eruption could cool the entire planet for a year or more. Only later did researchers connect the dots, linking the year without a summer to the eruption of Mount Tambora the year before. The mystery was finally solved. But strangely, this dark and difficult year also left behind some unexpected gifts, born directly out of the gloom. That summer, a group of riders was staying near a lake in Switzerland. Trapped indoors by the cold, wet, miserable weather, they sought ways to pass the time. To amuse themselves, they challenged each other to write frightening stories. And from that gloomy fireside contest came one of the most famous tales ever written. A young woman named Mary Shelley conceived the idea for her novel Frankenstein during that dark, stormy summer. The cold gloom of 1816 helped give birth to a literary masterpiece. The same gathering helped inspire early vampire fiction, planting seeds that would later grow into the entire genre of Gothic horror. A dark summer, a dark imagination. There were other strange legacies, too. The eerie, hazy skies and vivid sunsets of the period are thought to have influenced the dramatic, glowing paintings of some artists. Even the humble bicycle may owe something to that year. With horses dying for lack of feed, an inventor was inspired to create an early machine to replace them. So from one of the most miserable years in living memory came literature, art, and invention, strange flowers blooming in the cold and the dark. It is a curious thought that some of our most enduring stories and ideas were shaped in part by ash drifting silently through the upper atmosphere from a mountain that most of those affected had never heard of. The year without a summer stands as a powerful reminder of how connected our world truly is. A single mountain erupting in Indonesia chilled the entire planet. It reshaped harvests, drove migrations, sparked famine, and even shaped the stories we tell, all from a cloud of haze drifting silently through the upper sky. A whole season stolen by a distant volcano in a world that had no idea why. The strange and far-reaching story of the year without a summer. In 1976, a gang broke into one of the most secure bank vaults in France. They did not blow the door or storm the lobby. They came up from the sewers. For an entire long weekend, they feasted, drank wine, and cracked open hundreds of safe deposit boxes. Then they vanished with a fortune. Behind them, they left a message that became legend. Without weapons, without hatred, and without violence. This is the Société Générale heist. Our story takes place in the glamorous city of Nice, on the French Riviera, in the summer of 1976. And at its heart is one of the most colorful characters in the history of crime. A man named Albert Spaghieri. Spaghieri was no ordinary criminal. He was a former soldier and paratrooper, an adventurer, a photographer, and a man with a flair for the dramatic. He was charismatic, clever, and possessed of a certain roguish charm. He fancied himself a kind of gentleman criminal, and he dreamed of one truly spectacular crime. His target was a branch of the Société Générale, one of France's largest banks in the center of Nice. Specifically, its underground safe deposit vault. The vault held hundreds of safe deposit boxes belonging to the wealthy citizens of the Riviera, stuffed with cash, gold, jewelry, and valuables. It was considered impregnable. The vault was so secure that, the story goes, it was not even fitted with an alarm inside, because the bank believed no one could ever get in. That confidence was the bank's fatal flaw. And Spaghieri found the way in by looking not at the bank, but at the city beneath it. Beneath Nice ran a network of sewers and underground tunnels. Spaghieri realized that one of these tunnels passed reasonably close to the bank's vault. His plan was to enter the sewer system, dig a tunnel from there to the vault, and break in through the wall, completely bypassing every door and lock. To test whether the vault truly had no alarm, Spaghieri is said to have run a clever experiment. He rented a safe deposit box of his own. He then placed an alarm clock inside his box, set to go off in the middle of the night. If it rang and no one responded, he would know the vault was not monitored. The clock rang, the night passed, and nothing happened. His suspicion was confirmed. Once inside, the gang could work in complete safety, with all the time in the world. Spaghieri assembled a team, reportedly drawing on both local criminals and his own connections. With the plan set, the digging began. From the sewer, the gang began to excavate a tunnel toward the bank. It was around 8 meters long, slow and grueling work in the cramped, filthy underground. They worked for about 2 months, night after night, hauling out earth and shoring up the tunnel to keep it from collapsing on top of them. The conditions were miserable. They labored in the damp, the dark, and the stench of the sewers, edging ever closer to the vault wall. Finally, the tunnel reached the thick concrete wall of the vault. The gang set to work boring through it, the last barrier between them and the fortune inside. They chose their moment perfectly. They would strike over a long holiday weekend, when the bank would be closed for several days, giving them maximum time. On a July weekend in 1976, they broke through the wall and climbed into the vault. Before them lay hundreds of safe deposit boxes, ripe for the taking. And then, knowing they had days of undisturbed privacy, the gang did something extraordinary. They settled in and made themselves at home. To make sure no one could surprise them, they reportedly welded the vault door shut from the inside, sealing themselves in with the treasure. Then they got to work. Over the long weekend, they pried open and emptied hundreds of safe deposit boxes, one after another, filling bags with the contents. The haul was staggering. Cash, gold bars, jewelry, and valuables worth an enormous sum, by some estimates tens of millions of francs, one of the biggest robberies in French history. And famously, while they worked, they took their leisure. The gang is said to have brought food and wine, and even enjoyed proper meals down in the vault. Picture it. A gang of thieves sealed inside a bank vault, leisurely dining on pâté and wine, surrounded by a fortune, with no fear of being disturbed. It was this almost gentlemanly, unhurried quality that would help turn the robbery into a legend. There was a strange elegance to the whole affair. They had not stormed in with guns blazing. They had simply outsmarted the bank, sealed themselves in, and helped themselves at their leisure, as if they had all the time in the world. And for that long weekend, they did. When they had taken all they could carry, the gang prepared to leave, slipping back out through their tunnel and into the sewers, then away into the night. But before they went, Spaghetti left his calling card. A message scrawled for the police to find that would become one of the most famous lines in criminal history. The phrase in French translated roughly to, "without weapons, without hatred, and without violence." It was a cheeky, defiant signature on a near-perfect crime. When the bank reopened after the holiday, staff could not open the vault. It had been welded shut from the inside. When they finally got in, they were met with chaos. Hundreds of boxes lay broken open and empty. A tunnel gaped in the wall, and there was the mocking message left for the authorities to read. France was captivated. The audacity, the cleverness, and the gentlemanly style of the robbery made headlines and captured the public imagination. A huge investigation was launched to catch the perpetrators of such a spectacular crime. And for a while, the trail seemed to lead nowhere. But eventually, the police caught a break. A member of the gang, it is said, talked, and the threads began to lead back toward the mastermind, Albert Spaghetti. Spaghetti was arrested and brought in for questioning. The clever gentleman thief, it seemed, had finally been caught. But Spaghetti had one more trick to play. He cooperated in his charming way and even agreed to help the authorities. He played the role of the captured rogue who had decided to come clean. Months later, Spaghetti was brought to the office of the investigating judge to give evidence and go over details of the case. And that is when he made his move. During the meeting, Spaghetti asked to consult a document by the window. Then suddenly, he leapt out of the open window of the office. He landed on a parked car below, cushioning his fall, and jumped onto the back of a waiting motorcycle, which sped him away before anyone could react. It was a getaway worthy of a film. The gentleman thief had escaped from the very heart of the justice system in broad daylight and vanished. Albert Spaghetti was never recaptured. He spent the rest of his life on the run, living abroad under false names and reportedly taunting the authorities from afar. He even gave interviews and wrote about his exploits, cultivating his image as a daring, harmless rogue who had pulled off the perfect crime and gotten away with it. He lived as a free man for more than a decade, until he died of illness in the late 1980s. His body was reportedly returned to France only after his death. As for the fortune taken from the vault, the vast majority of it was never recovered. The gold, the jewels, and the cash had disappeared. Some of the gang members were caught and convicted, but much of the loot remained hidden, scattered, or spent, never to be seen again. The Société Générale heist became one of the most famous robberies in the world, inspiring books and films, and cementing Spaghetti's place as a legend of crime. A tunnel from the sewers, a weekend of wine in the vault, a mocking note, and a leap from a window into freedom. Without weapons, without hatred, without violence. The Société Générale heist. They walk into the most exclusive jewelry stores on Earth, smile at the staff, and within 60 seconds they are gone, along with millions in diamonds. They have struck in Tokyo, Paris, London, and Dubai. Their total haul is estimated at $500 million, and most of them have never been caught. They are not a single gang, but a shadowy international network of elite thieves. The police call them the Pink Panthers. This is their story. The name comes from a famous film series about a bumbling detective and a priceless diamond. But the real Pink Panthers are anything but bumbling. They earned the nickname in the year 2003 after a daring jewel robbery in London. The thieves had hidden a stolen ring inside a jar of face cream. That trick echoed a scene from one of the Pink Panther films. The press and police seized on the connection, and the name stuck. Since then, the label has been applied to a string of spectacular jewelry heists across the globe, all sharing a similar style of breathtaking audacity and precision. The thieves seem to glide through the most secure stores on Earth, as if the locks and guards were barely there at all. Each heist was bolder than the last, and each one deepened their legend. Interpol estimates the network has been responsible for some of the largest jewelry robberies in history, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars in gems. They have hit the most glamorous targets on Earth. Exclusive boutiques in the world's wealthiest cities, where a single display case can hold a fortune. And they do it with a speed and confidence that has left police forces around the world stunned and often empty-handed. So who are the Pink Panthers? Here is the crucial point. They are not a single organized crime family with a boss at the top. Instead, they are a loose, fluid network of hundreds of individual thieves who come together in small teams for specific jobs, then scatter. Investigators believe many of the core members come from the Balkans, in southeastern Europe, particularly from countries shaped by the wars of the 1990s. Some are thought to be former soldiers and fighters, hardened by conflict, skilled with weapons, discipline, and operating under pressure. These were people who had lost everything in war and who turned their skills toward an entirely different kind of operation: the precision robbery of the ultra-wealthy. They brought a soldier's discipline to crime. Surveillance, planning, rehearsal, and split-second execution under pressure. It was less like a smash and grab and more like a military strike. Because they operate as a network rather than a fixed gang, they are extraordinarily hard to map. Catch one team and the network simply carries on without them. Members are recruited, teams are formed for a single heist, and afterward everyone disappears back into ordinary life across many different countries. This structure, more like a web than a pyramid, is one of the great reasons they have proven so difficult to stop. But it is their method that has made them legendary. The Pink Panthers are masters of preparation, speed, and disguise. Every heist begins with meticulous reconnaissance. They study the target for weeks. The layout, the security, the staff, the escape routes, the timing. They often visit the store beforehand, posing as wealthy customers, charming and well-dressed, blending in perfectly with the clientele. They have used remarkable disguises. On some jobs, members reportedly disguised themselves as women or wore wigs and elaborate outfits to avoid recognition. In one famous Dubai heist, the gang smashed luxury cars straight through the glass front of a shopping mall to reach the jewelry store inside. When the moment comes, they move with astonishing speed. The actual robbery often takes less than a minute, sometimes only 30 seconds. They use hammers to shatter the display cases, sweep the diamonds into bags, and are gone before security or police can possibly respond. Everything is timed to the second. They know that the average police response time is several minutes, and they make sure their entire operation takes less than that. By the time help arrives, the street is empty and the diamonds are gone. They plan their escapes with military precision. Getaway vehicles, switch points, and clever distractions to throw off any pursuit. In one heist, they reportedly left behind a bag containing items meant to slow down police and even sprayed paint to obscure security cameras. Every detail was considered. Their list of heists reads like a thriller. Consider the robbery in Tokyo, where they stole a famous diamond necklace worth tens of millions in a matter of moments. Or the heist in Biarritz, France, where a charming thief simply walked into a store, drew a pistol, and calmly walked out with a fortune in jewels. In Dubai, the smash and grab with luxury cars netted the gang an enormous haul in just a few chaotic seconds. Again and again across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the pattern repeated. Lightning fast, brilliantly planned, and devastatingly effective. Perhaps their most legendary trait is the Great Escape. On more than one occasion, captured panthers have broken out of prison in spectacular fashion. In Switzerland, accomplices reportedly rammed a vehicle through a prison gate to free a member. In other cases, members escaped through windows, walls, and clever ruses. These jailbreaks only added to their mystique, painting the Pink Panthers as almost impossible to hold, as well as impossible to catch. And the stolen diamonds. They vanish into a murky underworld, recut, resold, and scattered, becoming almost impossible to trace. A loose stone once recut loses its identity. The fortune the Panthers steal effectively disappears into the global market, gone forever. Faced with this elusive network, the world's police forces fought back. Interpol launched a dedicated project to track and dismantle the Pink Panthers. They worked across borders, sharing intelligence, comparing the methods used in heists around the world, and slowly building a picture of the network. And they had successes. Over the years, a number of suspected Panthers were identified, tracked down, and arrested in countries across Europe. Some were convicted and imprisoned. Investigators painstakingly linked individuals to specific heists through fingerprints, footage, and forensic clues. But here is the frustrating truth. Catching individual members has never stopped the heists. The network is simply too large, too fluid, too decentralized. For every panther caught, others remained free. New teams formed, new jobs were planned, and the spectacular robberies continued. Even those imprisoned often served their time, were released, and investigators feared, slipped right back into the network. A few years behind bars was, to some of them, simply a cost of doing business. The lure of a single successful heist, worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, was always there to pull them back in. The very thing that makes the Pink Panthers so successful, their loose, leaderless structure, is exactly what makes them so impossible to truly defeat. There is no kingpin to arrest, no headquarters to raid. Cutting off one part of the web leaves the rest intact, ready to strike again. And the vast majority of the stolen jewels, that estimated $500 million in diamonds, has never been recovered. It is out there somewhere, recut and scattered across the world, adorning the wealthy who may have no idea of its origins. The heists have slowed in recent years, thanks to better security and international policing. But experts believe the network has never truly disappeared. As long as there are diamonds worth millions sitting behind a single pane of glass, there will be those with the nerve and the skill to come for them. Somewhere the Pink Panthers are believed to still operate, watching, planning, waiting for the next perfect target. They remain one of the most successful and elusive criminal forces in the world. Elegant, ruthless, and almost ghost-like in their ability to vanish. Gone in 60 seconds, scattered across the globe, and never truly caught. The world's most elite jewel thieves. The Pink Panthers. In 1997, a gang stole nearly $19 million in cash from an armored car depot, the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. There were no alarms, no shootout, no chase. Because the man behind it knew exactly where every camera pointed and every blind spot in the building. He worked there. It was almost the perfect crime. Almost. This is the story of the Dunbar armored heist. Our story takes place in Los Angeles, California, in September of 1997. In an industrial part of the city stood a large, secure building owned by the Dunbar Armored Company. Dunbar was an armored car company. Its trucks carried cash all over the city, to and from banks and businesses, and its depot was where that money was stored and counted. At any given time, the depot could hold enormous sums of cash. It was a fortress protected by alarms, vaults, and a network of security cameras watching every corner. On a normal day, breaking into such a place would be nearly impossible. The security was designed to stop exactly that kind of attack from the outside. But the Dunbar heist did not come from the outside. It came from within, planned by someone who understood the building's defenses better than almost anyone alive. That someone was a man named Alan Pace. And he did not have to break into the depot. He had the keys. Alan Pace worked for Dunbar as a regional safety inspector. It was a position of deep trust, and it gave him something priceless: complete knowledge of the building's security. As a safety inspector, Pace's job was to examine the depot systems. He knew where every camera was mounted, and crucially, where they were not. He had reportedly even photographed the building's layout during his inspections, mapping out the cameras, the vault, and the routines of the staff. Pace had been let go from the company, but his intimate knowledge remained. And he decided to use it for the heist of a lifetime. He gathered a crew of trusted men, friends he had known for years, people he believed would never betray him. Loyalty would be the foundation of the whole plan. The plan relied on three things: Pace's inside knowledge, the element of surprise, and striking at exactly the right moment, late on a Friday night. Friday night was when the depot held a huge amount of cash, gathered from the week's collections, waiting to be processed. The timing was everything. Pace knew the staff would be thin, the guards few, and the building at its most vulnerable. He knew the exact path to take to avoid every camera. On the night of the heist, Pace used a copied key to slip into the building, bringing his crew with him, moving through the carefully chosen blind spots. Their first target was the guards. The crew ambushed the security staff, catching them by surprise and subduing them before any alarm could be raised. With the guards under control, the gang had the run of the building. And then they went for the vault, the heart of the operation. Inside, they found exactly what Pace had promised: cash in enormous quantities sitting in the depot, ready to be taken. But here they made a clever choice. They did not grab everything blindly. They focused on the most valuable bundles, the large bills, the easiest to carry and to use. Working quickly, the crew loaded the money into a waiting truck they had brought right up to the loading dock, hidden from view. Bag after bag of cash was carried out and stacked into the vehicle. The amount was staggering, far more than almost any robbery before it. When they were finished, they had taken $18.9 million in cash. Nearly $19 million in a single night. Then they simply drove away into the Los Angeles night, leaving the subdued guards behind. The largest cash robbery in American history was complete. When the crime was discovered, investigators were stunned. The robbery had been executed with such precision that it was clearly an inside job. Whoever did this had known the building intimately. They had avoided the cameras, known the schedule, and moved like they owned the place. Suspicion naturally turned to current and former employees. Alan Pace, the former safety inspector, was an obvious person of interest. But suspicion is not proof. And Pace had been careful. There was no clear evidence tying him or his crew to the scene. They had worn gloves, avoided the cameras, and left little behind. For a while, the trail went cold. The crew, meanwhile, had nearly $19 million to deal with. And this is where every great heist faces its true test. Not the theft, but what comes after. They knew they could not suddenly flaunt their wealth. Sudden riches are the fastest way to attract attention. So they tried to lie low and spend carefully. For a remarkably long time, it worked. Months passed, then years. The crew held their nerve, kept their secret, and avoided the mistakes that catch most robbers. Most heists unravel within days because someone talks or spends too fast or cannot resist showing off. The Dunbar crew did none of those things, and for years they got clean away with it. The Dunbar heist looked like it might join the small, legendary list of perfect crimes, robberies that were never solved. But then came the slip. The fatal mistake came not from a dramatic shootout or a betrayal, but from a single, careless detail involving the money itself. One of the crew members was trying to use some of the stolen cash to invest in a business deal. To do so, he handed over a stack of bills. But the cash he handed over was still bound in the original wrappers. Wrappers stamped with markings that tied them directly to the Dunbar robbery. The person who received the marked money recognized the danger or grew suspicious, and the trail led investigators straight back toward the crew. It was the thread that unraveled everything. From that one careless handful of cash, the authorities began to close in. One by one, the members of the crew were identified and arrested. And as the pressure mounted, the loyalty that had held the gang together began to crack. Alan Pace, the mastermind, was caught. The near-perfect crime had been undone, not by brilliant detective work alone, but by a basic, avoidable error. Pace and his crew were convicted for the robbery. The mastermind received a long prison sentence for orchestrating the historic heist. It was a sobering end. The men had pulled off the largest cash robbery in the nation's history, only to be undone by a stack of bills in the wrong wrapper. But the story has one final, tantalizing twist. Because even after the convictions, most of the money was never recovered. Of the nearly $19 million stolen, only a fraction was ever found by investigators. The vast majority simply vanished. Millions of dollars from the Dunbar heist remain unaccounted for to this day. Hidden, spent, or buried somewhere, waiting. Some believe the money is still out there, stashed away by the crew, perhaps to be enjoyed after their release from prison. Others think it was quietly laundered and spent long ago. But no one has ever produced the full sum, and the location of the missing millions remains a mystery. It is one of the strange ironies of the case. The robbery was solved, the men were caught and convicted, and yet the prize at the center of it all was never truly found. The Dunbar armored heist remains the largest cash robbery in United States history. A near-perfect crime built on inside knowledge and patience. Brought down in the end by a single careless detail, and leaving behind a fortune in cash that, more than 2 decades later, has still never been found. $19 million, an inside man, and a stack of bills in the wrong wrapper. The Dunbar armored heist. It is the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. For nearly 4,000 years, it was the tallest building on the face of the earth. It is made of over 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as a car, raised into a mountain taller than a 40-story building. And it was built 4,500 years ago, with no machines, no iron tools, and no wheels as we know them. This is the story of the Great Pyramid. On the edge of the desert, near the modern city of Cairo, stands the Giza Plateau. And rising from it are the most famous structures ever built by human hands. The greatest of them is the Great Pyramid, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 4,500 years ago, during Egypt's Old Kingdom. Its scale is almost impossible to grasp. It was originally about 146 meters tall, and each of its 4 sides is over 230 meters long. It held the record as the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the great cathedrals of medieval Europe finally surpassed it. It is built from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, most weighing between 2 and 15 tons. Some of the granite blocks inside weigh as much as 80 tons. If you took all the stone in the Great Pyramid, it would build a wall stretching across entire countries. It is, quite simply, a man-made mountain. And it was raised in a relatively short time. Most estimates suggest it was completed in around 20 years, during the reign of a single pharaoh. To place over 2 million blocks in 20 years means setting a block roughly every few minutes, day and night, for 2 decades. The logistics alone are staggering. But it is not just the size that astonishes. It is the precision. The Great Pyramid was built with an accuracy that would challenge modern engineers. The base is almost perfectly level, varying by only a tiny fraction across its enormous footprint. The 4 sides are very nearly equal in length to within centimeters. Most remarkably, the pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west with extraordinary accuracy. It is off true north by only a tiny fraction of a degree. Achieving that kind of alignment without compasses or modern instruments required deep knowledge of the stars and the movement of the heavens. The ancient Egyptians likely used the stars and the rising and setting of the sun to find true north and lay out their perfect square upon the sand. The blocks themselves were cut and fitted so closely that, in places, you cannot fit a blade between them. This is craftsmanship of the very highest order. It is this combination of colossal scale and breathtaking precision, achieved so long ago, that has led some to ask a provocative question. Could ancient people really have done this? Over the years, the Great Pyramid has attracted wild theories. That it was built by a lost supercivilization, or even by visitors from the stars. But the truth, revealed by decades of archaeology, is far more inspiring than any fantasy. The pyramids were built by Egyptians, skilled, organized, and brilliant human beings. And we are not guessing. We have found their tombs, their tools, their villages, and even their records. The evidence of who built the pyramids is all around the plateau. For a long time, it was believed the pyramids were built by slaves, driven by the whip. But this turns out to be a myth. Archaeologists discovered the workers' town near the pyramids, along with their tombs. These were not slaves. They were respected, paid laborers, buried with honor near the king they served. We found the remains of their meals, vast quantities of bread, beef, and fish, showing they were well fed. Building the pyramid was a great national project. The workforce was a mix of permanent skilled craftsmen and large teams of laborers who rotated in, perhaps during the season when the Nile flooded the fields and farming paused. They were organized into named teams or gangs, with a sense of pride and competition. We even find their graffiti, the names of the work crews, painted inside the pyramid. This was not slavery. It was one of the greatest organized human efforts in history, a whole society working together to build a stairway to eternity for their god-king. So how did they actually do it? The first challenge was the stone. Most of it was limestone, quarried right there on the Giza Plateau, close to the building site. Workers cut the blocks from the bedrock using copper tools, wooden wedges, and stone pounders, splitting the limestone along natural seams. But some of the finest stone came from far away. The white casing stones came from across the river, and the massive granite blocks were floated hundreds of miles down the Nile from Aswan. The river was the great highway of Egypt. Heavy stone was loaded onto boats and barges and carried by water to the foot of the plateau, then hauled to the site. On land, the blocks were moved on wooden sledges, dragged across the sand by teams of men. And here the Egyptians used a clever trick. A wall painting shows workers pouring water onto the sand in front of a sledge, carrying a giant statue. We now know that wetting the sand dramatically reduces the friction. Damp sand becomes firm and slippery, so the heavy sledge glides far more easily. With this simple method, a team of men could move enormous weights across the desert. Experiments have confirmed it works. A relatively small team using ropes, sledges, and wet sand could move blocks of many tons. The mystery of moving the stone is largely solved. But the hardest question remains. Once you have the blocks at the site, how do you lift them higher and higher to build a mountain 146 meters tall? The answer, almost everyone agrees, is ramps. The Egyptians built great ramps of earth, rubble, and brick, up which the blocks could be dragged on sledges. But exactly what kind of ramp is still debated. A single long, straight ramp would have to be enormous, longer than the pyramid itself, requiring almost as much material. So many believe the Egyptians used ramps that wrapped around the pyramid, spiraling upward along its sides, growing with the structure. Others suggest internal ramps hidden inside the pyramid itself, or a combination of methods, with different ramps used at different heights. Intriguingly, the remains of a ramp system using post holes and steps were found at a nearby ancient quarry, showing the Egyptians had sophisticated tools for hauling stone up slopes. We may never know the exact combination of ramps used on the Great Pyramid because they were dismantled once the work was done, leaving little trace. But the principle is sound and well within the reach of the Egyptians. There is no need for magic or aliens. Only ramps, ropes, sledges, and the organized labor of a brilliant civilization. And what of the pyramid's purpose? The Great Pyramid was a tomb built to house the body of the pharaoh Khufu and to launch his soul into the afterlife among the stars. Deep inside are a series of passages and chambers, including the king's chamber, built of massive granite, where the pharaoh's stone sarcophagus still rests. The pyramid is riddled with mysteries still. Narrow shafts point to the stars. And in recent years, scientists using cosmic ray scanning discovered a huge, unknown void hidden within the structure. What that great empty space was for, we still do not know. Even after thousands of years of study, the Great Pyramid has not given up all of its secrets. Once the whole pyramid was covered in gleaming white casing stones, polished smooth, so that it shone in the desert sun like a beacon visible for miles. Time and earthquakes stripped away that casing, leaving the stepped core we see today. But even now, weathered and bare, it remains overwhelming to stand before. The Great Pyramid is not a mystery of impossible technology. It is a monument to what human beings can achieve through knowledge, organization, ambition, and sheer will. 4,500 years on, it still stands, the last ancient wonder, a mountain raised by human hands, reaching for eternity. The Great Pyramid. On a quiet November evening in 1987, millions of people in Chicago were watching television. Then, without warning, their screens flickered and something else took over. A figure in a strange mask appeared, jerking and distorted, in front of a flickering background. There was no sound at first, then a burst of buzzing noise. For a minute and a half, someone had stolen the airwaves. Then it vanished. Whoever did it has never been found. This is the Max Headroom Incident. To understand this strange event, we have to go back to the world of television in the 1980s. It was a very different time, before the internet, before streaming. In those days, people watched a handful of channels, broadcast through the air on powerful signals. Whatever was on those channels reached millions of homes at once. And there was a strange figure who was everywhere in popular culture at the time. A computer-generated character named Max Headroom. Max Headroom was presented as an artificial intelligence, a wisecracking digital host with slick-back hair, dark sunglasses, and a stuttering, glitching voice. He appeared in a television show, in commercials, and across the media. He was the very image of the futuristic, computerized world that people imagined was coming. This character is important because the person at the heart of our mystery chose to dress up as him. A disguise that was instantly recognizable, yet revealed nothing. Now, hijacking a television signal is not easy. The broadcasters used powerful transmitters, and to override them, an intruder would need an even more powerful signal of their own. It would take real technical knowledge, expensive equipment, and considerable nerve. And on the night of November the 22nd, 1987, someone had all three. The first intrusion happened during the evening sports report on a major Chicago news station. A sportscaster was reading the highlights of the day's games. Suddenly, the screen went black. Then, for a few seconds, the image of the masked Max Headroom figure appeared, rocking back and forth against a strange backdrop. There was no audio, only visual static and a harsh buzzing. The figure swayed silently, the eerie mask staring out at the audience for about 20 seconds. Then, just as suddenly, the signal cut back to the bewildered sportscaster. He laughed nervously and remarked that he did not know what that was all about. The station's engineers scrambled. They quickly switched their signal path to block the intruder. They had managed to push the hijacker off the air. But it was only the beginning. The intrusion had been brief, strange, and harmless. Viewers were puzzled, the station was annoyed, and most people assumed that would be the end of it. But the mysterious broadcaster was not finished. About 2 hours later, they struck again. And this time the intrusion was longer and far stranger. The second hijacking happened on a different station entirely, a public television channel that was airing an episode of a British science fiction show. Right in the middle of the program, the picture broke up and the masked figure returned. This time the audio worked and the figure spoke. What followed was about 90 seconds of bizarre, rambling, distorted ranting. The voice was warped and hard to understand, full of strange references and odd laughter. The figure made mocking comments, hummed a tune, and referenced the very channel it had first interrupted. It was clearly the same person, taunting the broadcasters. Behind the figure, a piece of corrugated metal spun, mimicking the moving background of the real Max Headroom character. The whole thing was deliberate and theatrical. Then the broadcast took a turn that made it genuinely disturbing. The scene shifted and a second person, partly out of view, appeared to be involved. The masked figure bent over, and the segment ended with a strange and crude act before the picture finally cut out and the normal program returned. And just like that, it was over. The whole second intrusion had lasted about a minute and a half. The masked broadcaster had vanished back into the airwaves. This public station had no engineers actively monitoring the signal at that hour, so unlike the first station, they could not cut it off. The intruder simply stopped on their own. By the next day, the strange double hijacking was the talk of the city, and soon the talk of the country. People wanted to know who had done it and how. Let us talk about the how. To override a commercial broadcast signal, the hijacker had to do something called signal intrusion. And it required serious power. Television stations beamed their programs up to relay points, often on top of tall buildings, which then broadcast to the city. To hijack the feed, the intruder had to overpower that link. That meant aiming a very strong signal from a custom-built transmitter directly at the station's relay point, drowning out the real broadcast with their own. This is not something an average person could do. It required knowledge of broadcast engineering, access to powerful and likely expensive equipment, and a precise understanding of how the signals traveled. Experts who studied the case agreed. Whoever did this was not a random prankster with a home video camera. They were someone with real technical expertise. Some suspected the culprits worked in the broadcast or telecommunications industry, where they would have the skills and perhaps the equipment to pull it off. And yet, despite the skill involved, the intrusion itself was strange and chaotic. It was not a political message or an advertisement. It was bizarre, mocking, and deeply odd. It seemed to be done purely for the thrill of it. A demonstration of power, perhaps. A dare, or simply a strange joke aimed at the entire city. The authorities took it very seriously. Hijacking a broadcast signal is a federal crime, and the agency that regulates the airwaves launched an investigation. They had video recordings of both intrusions, captured by viewers and the stations. They studied every frame, every word, every sound, searching for clues. They analyzed the background noises, the references in the rambling speech, and the equipment that would have been needed. They followed leads across the city. There was talk of large fines and even prison time for whoever was responsible. The pressure to catch them was real. And yet the investigation hit a wall. The problem with signal intrusion is that the intruder does not have to be at the station. They could broadcast from a vehicle or a hidden room, anywhere with a line of sight to the relay. And once they switched off their transmitter and packed up, there was almost nothing left to trace. No fingerprints in the airwaves. No address to raid. The hijackers had been careful. They wore a full mask in disguise. They never showed their faces or gave their real names. They left no solid evidence behind. Over the years, theories have swirled. Many believe it was the work of a small group, perhaps 2 or more people, given the second figure who appeared in the broadcast. Some pointed to the world of computer hobbyists and broadcast enthusiasts, tight-knit communities of people with exactly the right skills and a taste for mischief. Decades later, an anonymous online account claimed to know the identities of those involved, describing 2 brothers with a deep knowledge of electronics. But the claim could never be verified. Without a confession, without hard evidence, and with so much time gone by, the claim remains just another piece of the puzzle. Intriguing but unproven. And so the case has never been closed. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been confirmed as the masked figure who seized the airwaves over Chicago. Today, the recordings of the Max Headroom Incident still circulate online, as strange and unsettling now as they were then. People watch them trying to decode the rambling words. It remains one of the only successful television hijackings in American history to go completely unsolved. A ghost in the machine who appeared for 90 seconds and was never seen again. Someone out there knows exactly what happened that night in 1987. They built the transmitter. They wore the mask. And they have kept their secret for decades. The Max Headroom Incident. On a remote farm in the Bavarian countryside, a family began to notice strange things. Footprints in the snow that led to the house, but never led away. Footsteps in the empty attic in the dead of night. Within days, all 6 people who lived there were dead. And then something even stranger happened. Someone stayed behind in the house, cooking meals and feeding the animals. The killer lived among the dead for days, calmly, as if at home. And to this day, no one knows who it was. This is the mystery of Hinterkaifeck. The year was 1922. The place was Bavaria in southern Germany, a land of dark forests, quiet farms, and long, cold winters. The country was still reeling from the Great War, poor and uneasy. About 40 miles north of Munich stood a small farmstead. It had no proper name on most maps, but the locals called it Hinterkaifeck, meaning the farm behind the hamlet of Kaifeck. It was an isolated place, set apart from the village, surrounded by woods and open fields. The nearest neighbors were not close, and the farm kept to itself. The farm was home to the Gruber family. The head of the household was Andreas Gruber, a stern and difficult man in his 60s, known around the area for his bad temper. With him lived his wife, Cecilia, and his widowed daughter, Victoria. Victoria's two young children also lived on the farm, a 7-year-old girl, also named Cecilia, and a 2-year-old boy named Joseph. The family was not well liked, and rumors followed them. There were dark whispers in the village about the relationships inside that household. But out on the isolated farm, no one looked too closely. In the spring of 1922, the family needed a new maid. The previous one had left some months before, claiming the farm was haunted. She said she heard strange voices and footsteps, and she would not stay. A new maid, a woman named Maria Baumgartner, was hired. She arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the last day of March, 1922. She would be in the house for only a few hours before the horror began. But in the days leading up to her arrival, Andreas Gruber had begun to notice things. Deeply unsettling things that he could not explain. A few days earlier, he had found footprints in the fresh snow. They led from the edge of the forest directly toward his house. But there were no prints leading back. Whoever had made them had come to the farm and had not left. Gruber searched the property but found no one. Still, the prints disturbed him. Then came the sounds. He told neighbors he had heard footsteps in the attic above the house when no one should have been up there. He climbed up to investigate the attic but found nothing out of place. Yet the feeling that someone was there would not leave him. Other strange things happened. The family found a newspaper in the house that none of them had bought. The house key went missing, and Gruber noticed scratches and marks around the lock on a door. Today, looking back, these details are chilling. They strongly suggest that someone had already broken into the farm. That a stranger was hiding there in the attic, watching the family and waiting. But Andreas Gruber, for all his unease, did not call the police. He was a private, suspicious man, and he kept his troubles to himself. It was a decision that would prove fatal. We now believe the murders took place on the evening of March the 31st, 1922. What exactly happened that night, no one living knows. But investigators later pieced together a terrible sequence. It seems the killer lured the members of the family, one by one, out to the barn. Perhaps by some noise or some pretext that drew them out into the cold. There in the barn, 4 of them met their end. Andreas, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and the little granddaughter, also called Cecilia. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a long blade, used for breaking up soil. It was an implement found on almost any farm, ordinary and brutal. Inside the house, the killer then found the 2 who remained. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her room, and the toddler, Joseph, in his cot. Neither survived the night. In a single evening, the entire household, 6 people across 3 generations, had been wiped out. And then the killer did something that has haunted this case ever since. Instead of fleeing into the night, the murderer stayed. For days afterward, someone remained at Hinterkaifeck, living quietly inside the farmhouse where the family lay dead. Neighbors later recalled seeing smoke rising from the chimney over the following days. Someone was keeping the fire going. The cattle had been fed. The dog was still alive. And food in the kitchen had been eaten. The killer had moved into the home of the people he had just murdered, calmly tending the farm as if nothing at all had happened. It is one of the most disturbing details in the history of crime. The outside world did not yet know, but signs began to gather. The little girl, Cecilia, did not appear at school. The family failed to attend church on Sunday, which was unheard of. The new maid, who had only just arrived, did not send word to her family as expected. And the postman noticed that mail was piling up, uncollected, at the farm. Finally, on the 4th of April, several concerned neighbors decided to walk out to Hinterkaifeck together to see what was wrong. What they found would never leave them. In the barn, they discovered the bodies of the 4 family members, carefully covered with hay and an old door. Inside the house, they found the maid and the little boy. The horror of the scene was beyond anything the quiet community had ever known. Word spread quickly, and soon the police arrived from Munich to take charge of the investigation. But the crime scene had a serious problem. In the days since the murders, curious neighbors and onlookers had walked freely through the property and even cooked and eaten meals in the farmhouse kitchen. By the standards of forensic science today, the scene was hopelessly contaminated. Any evidence the killer might have left behind was trampled, moved, or destroyed before the experts ever arrived. Still, the investigators did what they could. Detectives from Munich examined the bodies, questioned the neighbors, and tried to reconstruct what had happened in those final days. They quickly concluded that robbery was not the motive. A significant amount of money was found untouched inside the house. Whoever had done this had not come for valuables. That made the crime even harder to understand. If not for money, then why? Why kill an entire family, including small children, and then stay on the farm for days afterward? The footprints in the snow, the footsteps in the attic, the missing key. All of it pointed to a killer who had known the family, watched them, and perhaps lived hidden in their house for days before striking. This suggested a deeply personal motive. Hatred, revenge, or some private grievance that the outside world knew nothing about. But the Grubers had kept their secrets, and the dead could not speak. Over the years, the police questioned more than 100 suspects. They followed leads across Germany and beyond. But no charge ever stuck, and no confession ever came. One disturbing theory centered on Victoria's husband, Karl, who had supposedly been killed in the First World War. Some wondered if he had secretly returned and taken a terrible revenge. But it was never proven. Others suspected neighbors, jealous rivals, or a drifter who had been seen in the area. Each theory had its supporters, and each one collapsed for lack of hard evidence. The case stayed open for decades. German police returned to it again and again, re-examining the old files with fresh eyes as the years passed. As late as 2007, students at a police academy took up the case as a training exercise, using modern methods to study the surviving evidence. They reportedly reached a conclusion and a name. But out of respect for the descendants of the person they suspected, who was long dead, they chose never to release that name publicly. And so even their answer remains a sealed door. The farmhouse itself was torn down a year after the murders. In the ruins, workers found one final, eerie detail. The mattock, the murder weapon, was discovered hidden in the attic. The attic where Andreas Gruber had heard those footsteps. The attic where the unseen stranger had perhaps been hiding all along. The killer had left his weapon in the very place where the haunting began. A small shrine was later built near the site, in memory of the 6 victims. The fields are quiet now, and few signs remain of the farm that once stood there. But the questions remain as sharp as ever. Who walked through the snow to that lonely house? Who waited in the attic? And who stayed behind feeding the animals while a family lay dead in the barn? A century has passed and we still have no certain answers. Hinterkaifeck remains one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in all of European history. 6 lives ended in a single night. A killer who never ran. And a silence that has lasted for 100 years. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck has never been solved. In a lonely valley in Norway, hikers found the body of a woman, burned beyond recognition. She had no name, no papers, and no past that anyone could trace. But she had left clues. 9 fake passports, a dozen false identities, clothing with every label cut away, and a notebook filled with a secret, handwritten code. Was she a spy? A criminal? A woman running for her life? Half a century later, we still do not know her name. This is the mystery of the Isdal Woman. The date was the 29th of November, 1970. The place was Isdalen, a steep and isolated valley near the city of Bergen, on the west coast of Norway. For centuries, Isdalen had a dark reputation. Its name translates roughly as the Ice Valley. In the past, people had died there, and locals sometimes called it the Valley of Death. On that cold Sunday, a university professor and his 2 young daughters were out hiking in the valley. As they made their way along a rocky slope, they came upon something terrible. Hidden among the stones was the body of a woman. She had been badly burned, her front charred almost beyond recognition. Around her lay a strange collection of objects. There were the remains of a packed lunch, some scattered jewelry, a broken umbrella, and the melted plastic of a bottle. Most striking of all, there was the lingering smell of gasoline. The terrified family rushed back to Bergen and alerted the police. Investigators climbed up into the valley to examine the scene, and from the very first moment, things did not add up. The position of the body, the burns, and the objects around it all suggested something deliberate. But who the woman was and how she had come to die in that lonely place, no one could say. The autopsy deepened the mystery. The woman had died from a combination of burns and poisoning. A large number of sleeping pills were found in her system. There was also a bruise on her neck, possibly from a blow or a fall. The official conclusion leaned towards suicide, but many of the investigators were not convinced. It was hard to imagine how a woman could douse herself in gasoline, set herself alight, and then lie down so neatly among the rocks. The scene felt arranged, as if someone wanted it to look like suicide. The first task was simple in theory. Identify the woman. The police took her fingerprints and her description and circulated them across Norway and beyond. But no one came forward. No family reported her missing. No friend recognized her face. It was as if the woman had never existed at all. The investigators noticed something odd about the body itself. Her teeth showed signs of advanced dental work, with gold fillings and crowns of a type used in Central and Eastern Europe, not in Norway. This was the first hint that the woman was a foreigner, a traveler from somewhere far away. And it was only the beginning of the strangeness to come. The break came when the police searched the Bergen railway station. There, in the left luggage office, they found 2 suitcases that matched the woman. The suitcases were a window into a secret life, and what they contained only made the mystery far stranger and far darker. Inside were clothes, cosmetics, wigs, and money in several different currencies. The woman had been carrying cash from Norway, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and Britain. But the most chilling detail was this. From every single item of clothing, every label and brand tag had been carefully cut away or scratched off. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to make sure that nothing could be traced. Even a prescription tube of cream had its label scraped clean, so the pharmacy could not be identified. This was not the work of an ordinary traveler. This was the careful behavior of someone trained to leave no trace. Someone who lived in the shadows. But the investigators caught one small slip. On a pair of rubber boots inside the suitcase, a faint shopping bag survived, and inside it, a clue pointing to a shop in Stavanger in southern Norway. And in the lining of the case, they found something extraordinary. A notebook filled with columns of letters and numbers, written in a code that no one could understand. It took time, but cryptographers eventually cracked it. The code was not some elaborate cipher. It was a record of the woman's travels, written in a private shorthand. Each line marked a date and a place she had visited, hidden behind a simple code of letters. When decoded, it revealed a woman constantly on the move across Europe. Paris, Hamburg, Basel, Geneva, and many cities in between. She had crisscrossed the continent for months, never staying long in any one place. And as the police traced her path, they uncovered the most astonishing fact of all. The woman had traveled under many different names. At hotels and border crossings across Europe, she had checked in as Genevieve, as Claudia, as Alexia, as Vera, and under at least 5 other identities. 9 names in all. Each identity came with its own passport, its own nationality, and its own carefully maintained story. She would arrive in a city, stay a few days, then vanish and reappear elsewhere under a new name. Hotel staff who remembered her described an elegant, well-dressed woman who spoke several languages fluently. German, French, English, and others. But she was careful, and she revealed almost nothing about herself. Witnesses recalled that she would sometimes request a room change soon after checking in. She seemed always watchful, always cautious, as though she feared being followed. In the days before her death, she had stayed at a hotel in Bergen under the name Fenella Lorch. She paid her bill and then she disappeared, only to be found dead in the valley soon after. By now, one explanation seemed to leap out at everyone. Multiple passports, constant travel, false names, coded notebooks, clothing stripped of every label. These were the hallmarks of a spy. The year was 1970, the height of the Cold War. Europe was crawling with intelligence agents from both East and West, watching one another in a vast, secret game. And Norway was not a quiet backwater in that game. It bordered the Soviet Union in the far north, and it was a key member of the Western Alliance. Its coastline held secrets worth watching. Investigators later learned something that fueled the spy theory. In the weeks before her death, the woman had reportedly traveled to areas of Norway where the military was testing new missiles. Had she been gathering intelligence on those tests? Was she watching the Norwegian military, or perhaps being watched herself by agents of another power? Some who worked on the case came to believe she was indeed an agent, possibly working for an intelligence service in Eastern Europe or beyond. But proof was impossible to find. There were even claims that the investigation was quietly shut down faster than it should have been. Some suspected that the authorities knew more than they were willing to say in public. Whatever the truth, the case slipped away. The woman was buried in Bergen in a zinc coffin in case anyone ever came to claim her. No one ever did. For decades, the Isdal Woman lay nameless. But the mystery refused to die. Journalists, historians, and amateur detectives kept returning to it, determined to give her back her name. Then in recent years, modern science offered new hope. Investigators reopened the case, using tools that had not existed in 1970. Scientists analyzed her teeth and bones using isotope testing, which can reveal where a person grew up based on the water and food they consumed in childhood. The results suggested she had likely been born in Central Europe, possibly in or near Germany, and had moved westward at some point in her youth. It was a clue, but not a name. Investigators also recovered her handwriting, her facial reconstruction, and even a sample of her DNA, hoping that one day a living relative might be found to match it. Appeals went out across Europe. Anyone who recognized the face, the handwriting, or the story was urged to come forward. A few promising leads emerged, but none of them closed the case. And so, more than 50 years later, the Isdal Woman remains unidentified. We know how she lived in motion in disguise, always watching over her shoulder. We know how she died in a cold and lonely valley. But we still do not know her name, where she truly came from, or who, if anyone, wanted her dead. The columns of code told us where she had been, but never who she was. She was a woman of many names and no name at all. A ghost of the Cold War who carried her secrets into the fire and left the rest of us to wonder. The Isdal Woman. In the year 897, in the city of Rome, a trial was held. The accused stood before the court, charged with serious crimes. There was just one problem. The accused was already dead. He had been dead for months. His body had been dug up from its grave, dressed in fine robes, and propped up on a throne to face the charges. And this was no ordinary man. He was a former pope. This is the story of one of the strangest events in history. The Cadaver Synod. To understand how such a bizarre event could take place, we have to understand the world of the late 9th century. It was a dark and chaotic time. The great empire that the famous king Charlemagne had built was crumbling. Across Europe, central authority was collapsing into a patchwork of feuding lords and factions. Italy in particular was a battleground. Powerful noble families fought viciously for control, and rival claimants struggled over who should rule. And caught in the middle of all this was the papacy, the office of the Pope, the head of the Western Church. It was the most powerful religious position in Europe. But in this era, the papacy was not just a spiritual office. It was a political prize, fought over by the great families of Rome and the warlords of Italy. Popes in this period rose and fell with terrifying speed. Many were installed by one faction, only to be torn down, imprisoned, or killed when their rivals gained the upper hand. It was an age of intrigue, betrayal, and violence at the very heart of the church. And it produced one of the most shocking acts of vengeance ever recorded. To tell this story, we need to meet two men. Two popes whose bitter rivalry would outlast even death itself. The first was Pope Formosus. He was an experienced and capable churchman who had served the church for many years and risen to become pope in the year 891. But Formosus had made enemies. In the tangled politics of Italy, he had backed certain claimants to power over others, and he had taken sides in dangerous feuds. He had crowned one ruler as emperor, then later turned to support a rival. In doing so, he earned the lasting hatred of the powerful family he had abandoned. Formosus served as pope for about 5 years, until his death from natural causes in 896. He was buried as popes are, with honor. And that, you might think, should have been the end of it. But his enemies were not finished with him. After his death, the throne of St. Peter changed hands rapidly in the usual chaos of the age. And before long, the papacy fell to a man named Stephen, who became Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was closely tied to the faction that had despised Formosus. Stephen's hatred of the dead Formosus seems to have been deep and personal, perhaps even bordering on obsession. And he conceived a plan to destroy his predecessor's memory entirely. In early 897, Pope Stephen ordered that the body of Formosus be removed from its tomb. The corpse, which had been buried for months, was exhumed. The decaying body was brought into a church in Rome, where a full ecclesiastical trial had been arranged. The dead pope was to be formally tried for his alleged crimes. The corpse was dressed in the full, magnificent vestments of a pope. It was then propped up on a throne, seated upright to face its accusers. Imagine the scene. a grand church filled with bishops and clergy. And there, on the papal throne, the dressed-up body of a man dead for the better part of a year. Pope Stephen himself acted as the chief accuser, reportedly shouting his charges at the silent corpse, working himself into a fury before the assembled court. And because a corpse cannot speak in its own defense, a young deacon was made to crouch behind the body and answer the questions on behalf of the dead pope. So the trial proceeded as a grotesque piece of theater. Stephen would hurl an accusation at the body, and the trembling deacon, hidden behind the throne, would mumble a denial. The charges against Formosus were largely political, dressed up in the language of church law. He was accused of unlawfully taking the papacy and of breaking sacred rules. But the real motive was plain to everyone. This was revenge. It was an attempt to erase Formosus, to undo everything he had done, and to humiliate him beyond the grave. The outcome was never in doubt. The court, packed and presided over by the dead man's greatest enemy, found the corpse guilty on all counts. And then came the punishment. Formosus was declared to have never been a legitimate pope. All of his official acts and appointments were declared null and void. But Stephen was not content with this. He ordered that the 3 fingers of the corpse's right hand, the fingers a pope used to give blessings, be cut off. The vestments were stripped from the body, and the mutilated corpse was then dragged through the streets of Rome and unceremoniously buried in a common grave. Even that was not the end. According to the accounts, the body was later dug up yet again, and this time it was thrown into the river Tiber. The dead pope, condemned, mutilated, and discarded, was cast into the waters to be carried away and forgotten forever. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty and strangeness. Pope Stephen had achieved his terrible revenge. But in his fury, he had badly misjudged the mood of the city and of the people of Rome. The trial of a corpse, the mutilation of a former pope, the desecration of a grave. To many this was monstrous, a horror that brought shame upon the church itself. And then came a sign that the superstitious people of the age could not ignore. The church where the grim trial had been held was struck by an earthquake and partly collapsed. To the people of Rome, this seemed like divine judgment, a sign of heaven's anger at what had been done. Public opinion turned violently against Pope Stephen. There is also a legend that the body of Formosus, after being thrown in the river, washed ashore, and that people claimed it began to perform miracles. Whether or not that is true, the tide of feeling had turned completely. The man who had tried a corpse was now the most hated figure in Rome. Within months, Stephen's enemies rose up against him. He was seized, stripped of his papal office, and thrown into prison. And there in his cell, Pope Stephen VI met a grim end. He was strangled to death just months after the bizarre trial he had staged. The man who had so cruelly violated the dead was himself dead within the year, the victim of the same brutal politics he had played. In the aftermath, the chaos continued. A later pope worked to undo the damage, reversing the verdict against Formosus and restoring his honor and his acts. The body of Formosus, recovered once more, was reburied with full honors in its proper resting place, the disgrace officially erased. Future popes went further, forbidding the practice of ever again putting a dead person on trial. The Cadaver Synod was so shameful that the church sought to ensure it could never be repeated. But the back and forth was not quite over. In the turbulent years that followed, the verdict was reversed, restored, and debated again, as different factions seized power. It was a perfect reflection of the age. A time so unstable that even the judgment passed on a dead man could be overturned and reinstated as the political winds shifted. Eventually, the reputation of Formosus was settled, and he was remembered as a legitimate pope. The strange chapter of the corpse on the throne was closed for good. Today, the Cadaver Synod stands as one of the most bizarre events in the long history of the Church. A moment when grief, hatred, and politics collided in the most macabre way imaginable. It is a window into a brutal and chaotic age, when even death offered no protection from the reach of one's enemies, and a corpse could be summoned to stand trial. A dead pope dressed in robes, propped on a throne and condemned. It really happened more than 1100 years ago. The Cadaver Synod. Deep in the jungles of Cambodia stands one of the greatest works ever built by human hands. A temple so vast it is the largest religious monument on Earth. And around it once sprawled a city so large it may have been the biggest in the entire world, home to perhaps 1 million people. Then it fell and the jungle swallowed it. This is the story of Angkor, the lost megacity of the mighty Khmer Empire. Our story takes us to Southeast Asia, to the jungles of what is now Cambodia, and to one of the most powerful empires the region has ever known. The Khmer Empire. For around 600 years, from roughly the 9th century onward, the Khmer Empire dominated much of mainland Southeast Asia, a great power of its age. Its capital and its heart was the city of Angkor. And Angkor was no ordinary city. It was a sprawling metropolis on a scale almost without equal in the medieval world. The Khmer kings saw themselves as god kings, divine rulers who connected their people to the heavens. And to express their power and devotion, they built on a colossal scale. Over the centuries, successive kings raised temple after temple across the region, each trying to outdo the last in size and splendor. The result was an enormous complex of monuments, palaces, and waterworks spread across a vast area, all woven into the jungle and the rice plains. And the crowning achievement of it all, the most famous structure, was built in the early 12th century by a king named Suryavarman II. Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is staggering. It was originally built as a Hindu temple dedicated to the god Vishnu, later becoming a Buddhist site, and it remains in use to this day. It is the largest religious monument ever constructed anywhere on Earth. Its scale is almost impossible to take in from the ground. The temple is surrounded by a massive moat, wide as a river, forming a giant rectangle around the complex. Crossing it, you approach along a great stone causeway. At its center rise 5 towers shaped like lotus buds, representing the sacred peaks of a holy mountain, the home of the gods in Hindu belief. The entire temple is a model of the cosmos in stone, carefully aligned, with its layout reflecting Hindu ideas of the universe and the heavens. Its walls are covered in vast galleries of carved relief, stretching for hundreds of meters, depicting gods, epic battles, mythological scenes, and the life of the kingdom. The craftsmanship is breathtaking. Thousands of carved figures, intricate decorations, and elegant architecture, all in sandstone hauled from distant quarries. Building Angkor Wat required millions of blocks of sandstone, floated and dragged from a quarry many miles away, and the labor of vast numbers of workers and elephants. And remarkably, it was completed in a few decades, a single king's monumental vision brought to life in stone within his own lifetime. But Angkor Wat, for all its fame, was just one temple in a vast urban landscape, because the city of Angkor that surrounded it was enormous. For a long time, the true size of Angkor was underestimated because so much of it lay hidden beneath the jungle and the rice fields. But in recent years, using advanced technology, archaeologists have mapped what lies beneath the vegetation. And the results were astonishing. They used a technique called LiDAR, firing lasers from aircraft to map the ground beneath the trees. It revealed the ghostly outlines of a sprawling, hidden city. Beneath the jungle lay a vast network of roads, canals, reservoirs, neighborhoods, and houses, spreading out over an area larger than many modern cities. Angkor was not just the temple complex. It was a true low-density metropolis, with the temples at its core and a huge urban sprawl all around. Nothing else quite like it existed anywhere on Earth at the time. At its peak, Angkor may have been home to around 750,000 to 1 million people. By that measure, it was likely the largest city in the world at the time. Standing among the ruins today, it is hard to imagine the noise and bustle that once filled these avenues. While the cities of medieval Europe held tens of thousands at most, Angkor sprawled across hundreds of square miles, supporting an immense population in the jungle. Sustaining so many people in a tropical landscape was a feat of organization as much as of engineering. And the key to feeding and sustaining that enormous population was, once again, the mastery of water. The Khmer built one of the most sophisticated water management systems of the ancient world. A vast network of canals, channels, moats, and enormous reservoirs. Water was not merely a resource here. It was the very foundation on which the entire civilization rose and, in time, fell. These huge reservoirs, called barrays, were artificial lakes of staggering size, capturing the heavy rains of the wet season to store water for the dry months. This system let the Khmer control the dramatic cycle of monsoon and drought, watering their rice fields and feeding their massive population year-round. It was an engineering marvel, the hidden foundation of Angkor's wealth and power. The whole civilization was, in a sense, built on the control of water. But this great strength would also become a great vulnerability. Because a civilization that depends so totally on water is at the mercy of the climate. For centuries, the system worked, and Angkor flourished as the jewel of Southeast Asia. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, the great city began to decline. The decline of Angkor was not a single event, but the result of many pressures piling up at once, much like other great lost civilizations. One major factor scientists now believe was climate. Studies of ancient tree rings reveal that the region was struck by extreme and erratic weather. There were decades of severe drought, which would have starved the reservoirs and the rice fields. And then devastating floods that may have damaged the water network. The vast, intricate water system that had been Angkor's greatest strength was difficult to maintain and vulnerable to these swings. As it faltered, so did the city. At the same time, there were other strains. Wars with neighboring kingdoms, shifts in trade, and a major change in religion as Buddhism rose and the old god-king system weakened. The center of power gradually shifted away from Angkor, toward locations closer to the sea and the growing trade routes, leaving the great inland city behind. Slowly over time, the population dwindled and dispersed. The great metropolis emptied out, its sprawling neighborhoods abandoned. Angkor Wat itself was never completely abandoned. It remained an important temple, tended by monks, even as the city around it faded. But the vast urban sprawl, the neighborhoods, the canals, and the smaller temples were left to the elements. And the jungle, ever patient, moved in. Over the centuries, the rainforest reclaimed much of Angkor. Trees grew up through the ruins, their massive roots wrapping around stone walls and temple towers. Some temples, like the famous Ta Prohm, became a haunting fusion of stone and tree, with giant roots cascading over and through the ancient architecture. These jungle-wrapped temples are among the most atmospheric ruins on Earth, a powerful image of nature, slowly reclaiming the works of a lost empire. And to the wider world, Angkor faded into legend. When European travelers later stumbled upon the ruins, some could scarcely believe such a place had been built in the jungle. But the Khmer people never truly forgot it, and Angkor Wat remained a sacred and revered site, a symbol of their heritage through the centuries. Today, Angkor is the pride of Cambodia, appearing on its national flag, and one of the most visited and studied archaeological sites in the world. Each year, vast numbers of travelers walk the same stone causeways as the god kings once did and watch the sun rise behind those famous lotus towers. It stands as a monument to the genius of the Khmer Empire, a people who built a megacity and the greatest temple on earth deep in the jungle and mastered the very rhythm of the rains. The largest city of its age, raised in the jungle, swallowed by the jungle, and found again. The lost megacity of the Khmer. Angkor. On an October evening in 1978, a young pilot flew his small plane out over the sea. Then he radioed that something strange was hovering above him. He said it was orbiting his aircraft, that it was playing a game with him. His last words were that it was not an aircraft. Then came a strange metallic sound. And then silence. The pilot and his plane vanished completely and were never found. This is the vanishing of Frederick Valentich. The year was 1978, and the place was the state of Victoria in southern Australia. Our story centers on a young man named Frederick Valentich. Frederick was 20 years old and he loved to fly. Flying was his great passion, and his dream was to one day become a professional pilot with an airline. He was a dedicated and enthusiastic aviator, working hard to build up his flying hours and qualifications. He was relatively inexperienced but deeply committed. Frederick was also, by some accounts, fascinated by the subject of unidentified flying objects. He took the idea of strange craft in the sky seriously. On the evening of October the 21st, 1978, Frederick planned a training flight. He would fly a small single-engine plane, a Cessna, on a route over the water. His destination was King Island, a small island sitting in the Bass Strait, the stretch of open sea that separates mainland Australia from the island of Tasmania. The flight would take him out over the dark waters of the strait, a lonely stretch of sea, as the evening light faded into night. Frederick took off in the early evening, in good weather, with clear skies. The conditions for flying were excellent. Everything began entirely normally. He flew out over the coast and headed across the Bass Strait toward King Island, maintaining radio contact with air traffic control on the mainland. For a while, everything proceeded exactly as it should, with nothing to suggest the strange turn the night was about to take. At around 7 in the evening, as he flew over the water, Frederick called the flight service officer he was in contact with, a man named Steve Roby. What followed was a radio conversation that has become one of the most famous and chilling recordings in aviation history. It lasted only a few minutes, but in those minutes, a routine training flight turned into something no one has ever been able to fully explain. Frederick's first question was strange. He asked the officer whether there was any other known aircraft in his area, flying at his altitude. The officer checked and replied that there was no known traffic in that area. As far as the authorities were aware, Frederick was alone in the sky. But Frederick was not convinced he was alone. He reported that a large aircraft seemed to be flying above him, perhaps 1,000 feet over his head. The officer again said there was no known traffic. And then Frederick's reports began to grow stranger and more urgent. He described the craft as having 4 bright lights, like landing lights that would shine and then suddenly vanish. The object seemed to be moving at great speed. He said it had passed over him at least 1,000 feet above, moving far faster than his own plane could go. It was, he said, approaching him from the east. Then the object seemed to play with him. Frederick reported that it was orbiting above him, circling his small plane in the darkening sky. His voice on the recording grew tense and confused. He struggled to describe what he was seeing. It was not behaving like any aircraft he knew. He said the thing had a shiny metal surface and that it was reflecting light. He described a green glow coming from it. It was unlike anything in his experience. Then Frederick reported a new and frightening problem. His engine was beginning to run roughly, coughing and sputtering as if something were wrong. The officer asked him to confirm his intentions. Frederick said he was going to try to continue on to King Island, but the strange craft was still hovering nearby. The officer, growing concerned, asked Frederick to confirm the kind of aircraft he was looking at. And Frederick gave the reply that has echoed ever since. He said it is not an aircraft. Those 4 words, spoken in genuine confusion and unease, are among the most haunting ever recorded by a pilot. And then, immediately after those words, something happened to the radio transmission. A strange sound came through. A metallic scraping noise. Witnesses who later heard the recording described it as an unidentified metallic, scraping sound lasting for several seconds, drowning out Frederick's voice. And then the radio went dead. The transmission cut off completely. The officer called out for Frederick again and again. There was no reply. Frederick Valentich, his strange encounter, and his small plane had simply vanished from the sky over the base strait in an instant. The flight service officer immediately raised the alarm. Something had gone terribly wrong out over the dark water, and a young pilot was missing. The clock was ticking. If Frederick's plane had gone down into the cold sea, every minute mattered. A rescue effort was launched without delay. A major search began that night and continued for days. Aircraft and ships scoured the base strait, searching the area where Frederick had last been heard. The search covered a vast area of open sea. Rescuers looked for wreckage, for an oil slick, for any sign at all of the missing plane. But they found nothing. No wreckage, no debris, no oil slick, no body. The plane and its pilot had vanished without leaving a single trace. This itself was deeply puzzling. When a small plane crashes into the sea, it usually leaves something behind. Floating debris, a fuel slick, scattered wreckage. Yet the base strait gave up nothing. It was as though Frederick and his Cessna had been plucked clean out of the sky. Years later, a small piece of an engine cowling washed ashore and was investigated to see if it came from Frederick's plane. The results were inconclusive. It could not be definitively linked to his aircraft. And so, even that faint clue led nowhere certain. The disappearance remained as complete as ever. The official investigation could not determine what had happened. Its conclusion was simply that the cause of the disappearance was unknown. In the absence of an answer, the theories rushed in. The most down-to-earth explanation is that Frederick became disoriented in the dark. Some experts suggested that the young, inexperienced pilot may have become confused, flying upside down without realizing it, and seen the reflection of his own lights on the water. In this theory, the strange craft with 4 lights was simply his own aircraft, mirrored in the sea below, as he flew inverted toward the water and crashed. It is a plausible explanation, and it would account for the engine trouble and the sudden end. But it does not satisfy everyone, and it leaves some details unexplained. Others have suggested that Frederick may have staged his own disappearance, or simply suffered an ordinary mechanical failure. But no evidence supports these ideas. And then, of course, there are those who take Frederick's final words at face value, who believe he truly encountered something in the sky that night that he could not explain. Reports came in from other people who claim to have seen strange lights in the sky over that part of Australia around the same time. But none could be confirmed, and in a case already heavy with mystery, they added more questions than answers. What we are left with is the recording. A calm flight that turned within minutes into confusion, fear, and that final, chilling phrase. It is not an aircraft. Frederick Valentich was never found. No certain wreckage was ever recovered. And the question of what he saw or thought he saw in the skies over the Bass Strait has never been answered. A young man who loved to fly, who took off one clear evening and simply never came back. The vanishing of Frederick Valentich. On a hot summer morning, 3 young children took a short bus ride to the beach, just a few minutes from their home. They never came back. Witnesses saw them playing with a tall, blonde stranger. And then the 2 girls and their little brother simply vanished without a trace. It is the case that ended a nation's innocence, and it has never been solved. This is the mystery of the Beaumont Children. The year was 1966 in the city of Adelaide in South Australia. It was a different world then, one that felt safe, settled, and innocent. In that era, it was perfectly normal for children to roam freely, to play in the streets and parks, and to travel short distances on their own without fear. Parents did not worry the way they do today. The idea that a child could simply be taken in broad daylight was almost unthinkable. This is the world the Beaumont family lived in. A happy, ordinary family in a quiet Adelaide suburb. There were 3 children. Jane, the eldest, who was 9 years old. Arna, who was 7. And the youngest, Grant, a little boy of just 4. Jane, the eldest, was responsible and mature for her age, the kind of big sister who looked after her younger siblings carefully. Their parents trusted them, as most parents did in those days, to take a short, familiar bus trip to the local beach on a hot day. The date was the 26th of January, 1966. Australia Day. And it was blisteringly hot, a perfect day for the beach. The children asked to go to Glenelg Beach, a popular spot only a short bus ride away, which they had visited many times before. Their mother agreed. She gave them money for the bus and for lunch and sent them off, expecting them back by early afternoon. It was a completely ordinary decision. The 3 children caught the bus to Glenelg that morning. The bus driver later remembered them, ordinary and happy, on their familiar trip to the sea. They arrived at the beach, a bright, busy place full of families enjoying the summer holiday. And there, among the crowds, they were seen by several witnesses. At first, everything seemed normal. The children played in the sand and the water, like any others on that hot Australia day. But as witnesses would later recall, the children were not alone for long. They were seen in the company of a man. And that man is at the very heart of this mystery. Several people reported seeing the 3 Beaumont children playing with a tall, thin man with blonde or light brown hair and a tanned, athletic build. He appeared to be in his 30s, and the children seemed comfortable with him, playing happily, laughing, as if he were someone they trusted. Witnesses described the children playing a game with the man under a sprinkler near the beach, all of them at ease. This troubled investigators deeply. Because the children's ease suggested this was not a stranger they had just met. It hinted that the man may have met them before and gained their trust over time. There were other unsettling signs. The children had been given more money than their mother had sent them with. Someone, it seemed, had bought them lunch. A shopkeeper recalled the eldest girl, Jane, buying pasties and a meat pie, paying with a £1 note, far more money than her mother had given her. Where had the extra money come from? The obvious, chilling answer is that the man had given it to them. He was grooming their trust, providing for them. The last confirmed sighting placed the children with this man in the late morning. After that, they were seen leaving the beach area, apparently in his company. And then the 3 Beaumont children walked out of the historical record and into one of the darkest mysteries in their nation's history. Early that afternoon, when the children did not return home as expected, their mother began to worry. By evening, the worry had become panic. Their father rushed to the beach to search, scouring the area as the sun went down, but there was no sign of the 3 children anywhere. The family contacted the police, and a search began that night. But the 3 children had simply vanished, leaving the city in shock. The disappearance triggered one of the largest police investigations the country had ever seen. The whole of Australia became gripped by the case. Days turned into weeks. The search spread across the city and beyond. Volunteers combed beaches, fields, and waterways. But nothing was found. No bodies, no clothing, no belongings, no clear trace of where the children had gone or who had taken them. It was as if they had evaporated in the summer heat. The case sent a wave of fear through the nation. The comfortable belief that children were safe to roam freely was shattered in a single afternoon. Parents across the country suddenly began to watch their children more closely. In a real sense, the disappearance of the Beaumont children marked the end of an age of innocence. The simple freedoms that an entire generation had taken for granted, walking to the shops, catching a bus alone, spending a day at the beach unsupervised, quietly came to an end. A whole nation grew more fearful overnight. The investigation was vast and determined, but it was hampered by the era. There were no security cameras, no DNA testing, and few of the tools detectives rely on today. The single best lead was the tall, blonde man. Police worked with witnesses to create a sketch of his face, which was circulated far and wide. The sketch became one of the most recognizable images in the country. But despite countless tips and reported sightings, the man was never identified. The police chased thousands of leads over the years. They followed up on reported sightings of the children and on countless possible suspects, but every trail went cold. There were strange episodes. A supposed psychic drew huge attention, claiming to lead the family to the children's remains, but it came to nothing. The Beaumont parents received cruel hoax letters and endured years of false hope and bitter disappointment, never knowing what had become of their children. They lived out the rest of their lives without ever learning the truth, the case casting a permanent shadow over the family and the city. Over the decades, the investigation never truly closed, and several suspects have been considered, some more seriously than others. One major suspect was a wealthy local businessman, accused by others of terrible crimes against children, whose properties were searched decades later. On more than one occasion in recent years, sites linked to suspects were excavated, with searchers hoping to finally find the children's remains. Each dig drew enormous attention and hope, and each one so far has ended in disappointment. No trace of the children has ever been found. Other suspects, including known offenders active in the area at the time, have been examined. But in every case, the evidence has fallen short of an answer. Names have come and gone over the decades, each one raising hopes that the mystery might finally be solved, and each one ultimately leading nowhere certain. The passage of time has only made the case harder. Witnesses have aged and died. Memories have faded. The tall, blonde man, if alive, would be elderly now, if he lives at all. And so the central questions remain exactly as they were on that hot Australia day. Who was the man on the beach? And what happened to Jane, Arna, and Grant? Decades later, the disappearance of the Beaumont children remains unsolved. One of the most famous and heartbreaking mysteries their country has ever known. 3 children on a short trip to the beach on a sunny holiday who simply never came home and were never seen again. A nation's innocence lost in a single afternoon, and a mystery that has haunted it ever since. The Beaumont children. On a clear afternoon in 1876, a woman was working outside her Kentucky home when something began to fall from the sky. It was not rain. It was not hail. It was meat. Flakes and chunks of red flesh drifting down from a cloudless sky, scattering across her yard like a gruesome snowfall. People were horrified, baffled, and fascinated. Some even tasted it. And the explanation is one of the strangest in the history of science. This is the Kentucky meat shower. Our story takes place in March of 1876 in Bath County, a rural part of the state of Kentucky in the United States. It was a quiet farming community, a place of simple homes, open fields, and ordinary country life. Nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen there. On the property of a farmer named Alan Crouch lived his family, including his wife, who was outside that day making soap in the yard. It was a calm, clear day. The sky overhead was blue and cloudless, with no sign of any storm or unusual weather. And then the strangest thing happened. Without any warning, small flakes of meat began to fall out of the sky, fluttering down all around her like large snowflakes. The pieces were mostly small, a few inches across, though some were reportedly larger. They drifted down over an area of the field, scattering across the ground and the fences. The fall lasted only a short while, perhaps a few minutes. But by the time it stopped, the ground was littered with these strange, fleshy flakes. Mrs. Crouch was understandably astonished. Meat does not simply fall from a clear sky. She and the others who saw it had no idea what to make of it. The flakes looked like flesh, red, soft, and unmistakably organic. It was as if some great unseen butcher in the sky had scattered scraps across the Kentucky countryside. Word of the bizarre event spread quickly through the community, and soon people were coming to see the strange substance for themselves. Now, here is a detail that may turn your stomach. In an effort to identify what had fallen, too brave or perhaps foolish, men decided to taste it. After sampling the mysterious meat, they gave their expert opinion. It tasted, they said, like either mutton or venison. That is, like lamb or deer. This was not as reckless as it might sound by the standards of the time. Tasting an unknown substance was an old, if risky, way of trying to identify it. But it did not solve the mystery. Knowing it tasted like game meat did not explain how it had come to fall in flakes from a perfectly clear sky. The story was simply too strange and too sensational to stay local. Soon it had spread far beyond Kentucky, reaching newspapers across the country and beyond. The Kentucky meat shower became a genuine sensation, and it caught the attention not just of the curious public, but of serious scientists. This was an age of growing scientific curiosity, and the idea of meat falling from the sky was an irresistible puzzle. Samples of the substance were preserved and sent off for study. Some samples were placed in preservative and examined by scientists, eager to determine exactly what this mysterious flesh actually was. And the results of these examinations were, at first, rather confusing and contradictory. Different experts reached different conclusions. Some who examined the tissue under a microscope concluded it was lung tissue, possibly from a horse or a human infant, which only made the mystery more disturbing. Others identified it as muscle tissue or cartilage. The varied findings suggested the flakes were made up of several different kinds of animal tissue. This was a crucial clue, though no one quite realized it yet. The substance was not one single thing. It was a mixture of different parts of an animal or animals. So now the scientists faced two questions. What was this meat made of various tissues? And how on earth had it ended up falling from the sky? As news of the event spread, theories began to multiply, ranging from the scientific to the wildly imaginative. One early idea was that the meat had been swept up from somewhere far away by a powerful wind or a tornado, carried through the air, and then dropped over Kentucky. But this theory had a fatal flaw. The day had been calm and clear. There had been no storm, no strong wind, nothing that could have carried meat across the sky. A stranger theory suggested the substance was not meat at all, but a peculiar type of bacteria or a substance sometimes called star jelly, which was poorly understood. But the microscopic examinations had clearly shown actual animal tissue. Lung, muscle, cartilage. This was real flesh, not some strange mold or jelly. So the real question remained. What natural process could possibly scatter chunks of various animal tissues across a field, from a clear sky, with no storm in sight? The answer, when it came, was so strange, so vivid, and so memorable that it has been attached to this story ever since. The leading explanation involves a particular kind of bird. The vulture, and specifically, a vulture's most unpleasant defensive habit. Vultures, you see, are scavengers that gorge themselves on carrion, the flesh of dead animals. And they have a remarkable and revolting trick when they feel threatened. When a vulture is startled or needs to flee quickly, it will vomit up the contents of its stomach. This lightens its body, making it easier to take off, and may deter a predator. Now imagine a whole flock of vultures flying high over Kentucky, their stomachs full of the partly digested flesh of dead animals they had been feeding on. If something startled the entire flock at once, all of them might disgorge their stomach contents at the same moment, high in the air. And that mass of regurgitated meat, made up of various tissues from various carcasses, would then rain down over the ground below. It would explain everything. The mixture of different tissues, the fall from a clear sky, and the fact that the flying birds themselves might have been too high to be noticed from the ground. It is a deeply unglamorous and stomach-churning explanation. The famous Kentucky meat shower was, most likely, a shower of vulture vomit. Supporting this idea, observers noted that vultures were indeed common in the area, and that the behavior fit perfectly with what was known about the birds. While we cannot be 100% certain after all this time, the vulture theory is widely regarded as the most likely and sensible explanation for the event. It takes something that seemed utterly supernatural, meat falling from the heavens, and grounds it firmly in the messy, ordinary reality of the natural world. There is something wonderful about that. A mystery that gripped scientists and newspapers that seemed to defy all logic turned out to have a perfectly natural, if disgusting, cause. The Kentucky meat shower reminds us that nature is often far stranger than fiction, and that the truth can be both mundane and astonishing at the same time. A clear sky raining flesh sounds like something out of a nightmare or a legend. The real answer, a flock of queasy birds, is somehow even harder to forget. It also stands as a charming example of early science at work. Real people gathering real samples and using the tools they had to chase down an impossible-seeming puzzle. And remarkably, a preserved sample of the meat is said to still exist to this day, kept in a collection, a tiny relic of that bizarre afternoon. So the next time you complain about the weather, spare a thought for the people of Bath County, Kentucky, who once looked up and found it raining meat. A clear sky, a quiet farm, and a shower of flesh that baffled a nation, before science traced it back to a flock of startled, queasy vultures. One of the strangest things ever to fall from the sky, and a perfect reminder that the world is full of wonders, even the revolting ones. The Kentucky meat shower. Somewhere beneath the waves, the legend says, lies a lost world. A great and golden civilization, more advanced than any of its time. In a single day and a single night of catastrophe, it was swallowed by the sea, and and vanished from the earth forever. For more than 2,000 years, the world has searched for it. Was it real or only a dream? This is the story of Atlantis. The story of Atlantis does not come from sailors' rumors or dusty myths of unknown origin. It comes from one of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. Around 360 years before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. And in them, he told the tale of Atlantis. Plato claimed the story was true and that it had been passed down a long chain. From Egyptian priests to the Greek statesman Solon, and finally down to Plato's own time. According to the story, the tale was ancient even then. The events it described had supposedly happened around 9,000 years before Solon's day. And the story Plato told was magnificent. He described a great island, larger than ancient Libya and Asia combined, lying out in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. On this island stood the kingdom of Atlantis, a powerful and wealthy naval empire, ruled by mighty kings descended, it was said, from the sea god Poseidon himself. The capital city was a marvel. It was built in rings, alternating bands of land and water, circling out from a central hill, connected by bridges and canals. At its heart stood a great temple to Poseidon, gleaming with silver and gold, and a metal the ancients called orichalcum, said to shine like fire. Plato described a land of abundance. Fertile plains, rich harvests, hot and cold springs, herds of animals, even elephants, and forests full of timber. The Atlanteans were great engineers and builders. They raised palaces, harbors, and docks, and dug enormous canals to bring ships into the heart of their city. Their power grew and their empire spread. According to Plato, Atlantis came to rule over many other islands and parts of the distant continents, building a vast dominion. For generations, the Atlanteans were noble and virtuous, ruling wisely, untouched by greed. They held to the divine nature passed down from their god ancestors. But over time, Plato wrote, that divine nature faded. The Atlanteans became corrupted by their own wealth and power. Greed and ambition took hold. No longer content with their vast empire, the Atlanteans set out to conquer the rest of the known world, sweeping eastward across the Mediterranean with their fleets and armies. And here in Plato's telling, they met their match. One city stood against the might of Atlantis. According to the story, it was ancient Athens. Against all odds, the Athenians and their allies resisted the invaders and ultimately defeated the great empire of Atlantis, freeing the conquered peoples. But the story does not end in triumph. It ends in catastrophe. For the gods, angered by the corruption of Atlantis, were about to deliver a final judgment. Plato wrote that there came violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single terrible day and night, the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and disappeared. An entire civilization gone beneath the waves. Its proud cities, its golden temples, its mighty fleets, all dragged down into the depths in an instant. And so, Plato says, the sea in that place became impassable, blocked by the mud and shoals left where the great island had sunk. Atlantis was lost to time. It is a breathtaking story. A golden empire brought low by its own pride and erased from the earth by the wrath of the gods. But here is the great question. Did any of it actually happen? Was Atlantis a real place, a true memory of a vanished civilization? Or was it something else entirely? This is the debate that has raged for over 2,000 years, ever since Plato first set down the tale. Many scholars believe Atlantis was never meant to be taken literally. They argue that Plato invented the story as a kind of fable, a teaching tool. In this view, Atlantis is a warning. It represents a powerful, arrogant civilization, while idealized Athens represents virtue and balance. The story is about pride, corruption, and downfall. It is striking that no earlier Greek writer ever mentions Atlantis. The story appears fully formed only in Plato's work, which makes some suspect he created it himself. Even Plato's own student, the great philosopher Aristotle, was reportedly skeptical, suggesting that the man who invented Atlantis had also made it sink. And there are real problems with taking the tale literally. The date Plato gives, around 11,000 years ago, places Atlantis deep in the Stone Age. There is no evidence that any advanced, city-building naval empire existed anywhere on Earth at that time. The scale and timing simply do not fit what we know. And yet the story refuses to die. Because many believe that even if Atlantis is a fable, it may be woven from threads of real events and real places. After all, Plato was writing in a world that remembered real catastrophes. Earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis were known to swallow cities. Such things truly happened. And so the hunt for a real-world inspiration for Atlantis has produced dozens of candidates, scattered across the globe. Some have looked far out into the Atlantic, as Plato's geography suggests, proposing islands or sunken lands in the deep ocean. But no convincing ruins have ever been found there. Others have placed Atlantis in the most exotic locations imaginable, from the Caribbean to Antarctica, but these ideas rest on speculation rather than evidence. But there is one theory that many scholars take seriously. It does not look across the Atlantic at all. It looks much closer to Plato's home in the Mediterranean. And it centers on a real catastrophe, one of the most violent events in the ancient world. The eruption of a volcano on the island we now call Santorini. In the Bronze Age, this island, also known as Thura, was home to a flourishing culture connected to one of the most advanced civilizations of the age. Then, around 3,500 years ago, the volcano at the heart of the island exploded in a colossal eruption, one of the largest in human history. The blast blew out the center of the island, which collapsed into the sea. It is thought to have triggered enormous tsunamis that swept across the region. And those waves may have devastated the heartland of a great seafaring people, the Minoans, who built a brilliant civilization on the island of Crete. The Minoans were everything Atlantis was said to be. A wealthy, powerful, sophisticated naval culture with grand palaces, advanced art, and mastery of the sea. After the eruption and the tsunamis, the Minoan civilization went into decline and eventually faded away, its glory lost. A great sea power brought down by a watery catastrophe. The parallels are striking. A magnificent island civilization destroyed by a natural disaster from the sea. Some believe the memory of this real event, distorted over centuries, became the legend of Atlantis. The numbers and the location were exaggerated as the story passed down the generations, the dates inflated, the island moved out into the ocean. But at its core may lie a true catastrophe. It is a compelling idea, and yet it remains a theory. We have no inscription, no artifact, nothing that says here was Atlantis. The connection is suggestive but unproven. And so the search goes on. To this day, explorers, scientists, and dreamers scour the seas and the sands, hoping to find some trace of the lost world. Whether it was a real civilization, a faded memory of a true disaster, or simply the most enduring fable ever told, Atlantis has never loosened its grip on our imagination. A golden empire lost beneath the waves that we cannot stop searching for. Perhaps that is the true power of Atlantis. The dream of a perfect world lost to time.